The rain began its descent upon the coastal town just before twilight. At first, it came as a whisper against the tiled rooftops and the stone-paved lanes, the kind of rain that could be mistaken for the sigh of the sea. By the time darkness fell, it had grown into a steady cascade, turning the streets into mirror-like rivers, each carrying the reflection of flickering lanterns and distant windows. Somewhere in this quiet storm, a single carriage rolled slowly over the slick cobblestones, its wheels cutting through shallow pools of water with soft splashes. Inside the carriage sat Eleanor Whitcomb, wrapped in a heavy traveling cloak of deep green wool. The air was damp and cool, smelling faintly of salt from the harbor she had passed earlier. Her gloved hands rested loosely in her lap, yet her fingers were tense, curled slightly into her palms. She had been traveling since morning, returning from her aunt's estate in the countryside, a visit that had stretched longer than intended due to the season's unpredictable weather. Now the rain was falling with such intent that the driver had called down to her, suggesting they stop for shelter at the next inn. Eleanor had agreed, more to avoid an accident on the slick roads than from any desire for company. Yet, as the carriage turned and a warm yellow glow appeared ahead, she felt a small stirring of curiosity. The inn was called the Sparrow's Rest. Its sign swayed in the wind. Creaking slightly on its chain, the painted bird's wings worn with time. The building itself was modest, but there was a sturdiness to its timber frame, and a promise of warmth in the light spilling through its diamond-paned windows. The driver dismounted quickly, opening the door for her. The moment Eleanor stepped down, the rain seized her entirely, soaking the edges of her cloak, finding its way into her hair despite the hood. She hurried inside, her boots tapping against the wood of the porch before the heavy door swung closed behind her. The inn's common room was dim but inviting, lit by the golden flicker of a central hearth. The scent of burning oak mingled with that of mulled wine, roasted chestnuts, and a faint trace of tobacco smoke. A handful of travelers were scattered about. Two merchants in quiet conversation at a corner table, a pair of sailors playing cards near the door, and one man sitting alone at a table close to the fire. It was this man who looked up when she entered. He was seated in a posture of unstudied ease, one arm draped over the back of his chair, his dark hair falling loosely across his brow. His coat was of fine cut, but travel-worn at the edges, its dark blue fabric showing the faintest sheen in the firelight. Beneath it, his white linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the strong line of his throat. But it was not his clothes that caught Eleanor's attention. It was his eyes. They were steady, unhurried, as if they had already taken in her entire form and settled upon her face not out of curiosity, but out of certainty. There was no boldness in them, yet there was an intensity that made her hesitate for the briefest moment before she continued toward a vacant table. Her cloak was damp and heavy, the hem trailing small droplets onto the floorboards. She removed her gloves slowly, conscious of the warmth creeping into her fingers from the fire. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered woman with kind eyes, approached and set a steaming cup of spiced wine before her. Eleanor thanked her softly, then glanced, without meaning to, toward the man again. This time, she found him still watching her, though now a faint, almost imperceptible smile had touched the corner of his mouth. She looked away quickly, focusing on her cup. The wine was fragrant and rich, carrying the warmth of cinnamon and orange peel. She let the heat seep into her, loosening the tension that had gathered in her shoulders during the long journey. The rain outside deepened in sound, pressing against the inn's walls as though seeking entrance. The wind rattled the shutters briefly, but the fire's crackle made the room feel safe, enclosed in its own world. From time to time, she could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze returning to her. It was not the gaze of a man assessing a woman for beauty alone. There was something else in it, a quiet recognition, as though he had been waiting for her, without knowing until this moment that he had been waiting at all. She told herself it was only her imagination. Travelers and small inns often notice one another. There was nothing more to it. And yet, her thoughts kept straying to him, wondering about the sound of his voice, the origin of his journey, the reason for his solitary place by the fire. When the innkeeper came to refill her wine, Eleanor allowed herself another glance toward him. Their eyes met for a fraction longer than politeness demanded, and this time he inclined his head slightly, a gesture at once courteous and strangely intimate. In that moment, she felt the smallest shift within herself, like the faint turning of a key in a lock she had not realized existed. The rain outside whispered on, but the rhythm of the night had changed. Something had begun quietly, without announcement, and she could not yet name it. The rain had become a steady lullaby against the walls, a sound that made the moments between thoughts stretch longer than usual. The fire's light moved gently across the room, painting everything in warm gold and deep shadow. Eleanor was content to sit quietly, her fingers curved around her wine cup, though her awareness of the man by the fire had not lessened in the slightest. It was as if the entire inn existed in two layers, the one everyone else moved through, with the murmured card games and the soft clink of tankards, and another, quieter world that contained only the two of them. After a time, she noticed that the innkeeper had approached him and spoken in a low voice. He listened, gave a brief answer, and then rose from his seat. The movement drew her eyes before she could stop herself. He crossed the room with an unhurried stride, the sort of gait that spoke of a man who had nothing to prove and no need to rush. When he reached her table, he paused, inclining his head slightly in greeting. "Forgive me," he said, his voice low and warm, carrying the faintest trace of a coastal accent. "The inn is crowded tonight. Might I join you?" Eleanor glanced around. It was true. A pair of travelers had just claimed the last vacant table. There was no reason to refuse him, though her pulse had quickened without her permission. "Of course," she said, her voice measured. He drew out the chair opposite hers and sat, resting his hands lightly on the table. For a moment neither spoke, the quiet between them filled by the rain and the fire. Then he gave her that same almost smile she had noticed earlier, and she found it was more disarming at close range. "You've come a long way," he observed, nodding slightly toward the damp hem of her cloak where it hung over the chair. "From the countryside," she replied. "The roads are poor in this weather." "Poor?" "Yes, and yet you brave them," he said, as if the fact held some significance. "I was caught in this storm myself 2 days ago, though I found less hospitable shelter than this. The sparrow's rest is generous for a traveler." The way he said the word generous carried a weight she could not entirely name. They spoke first of simple matters: the storm, the difficulty of winter travel, the quality of the inn's spiced wine. His manner was direct without being intrusive, his gaze steady without being presumptuous. He asked only as much as politeness allowed, yet somehow she felt as though he understood more than she told him. Between their words, she became increasingly aware of the small details: the way his fingers, long and strong, curved easily around the stem of his cup, the faint scar along his jawline just visible in the firelight, the depth of his eyes, which seemed almost to change color with the shifting flames. It was strange how quickly the sense of strangeness between them began to dissolve. The more they spoke, the more it felt like the conversation had begun long before the night, and they were merely continuing it. At one point, the innkeeper brought them a small plate of roasted chestnuts, and their fingers brushed when they reached for the same one. It was the lightest of touches, yet it seemed to ripple through her in a way she could not account for. He noticed. She could see it in the way his gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary. But he said nothing. Instead, he leaned back slightly, studying her with an expression that was neither wholly guarded nor entirely open. "May I ask your name?" She hesitated, not because she wished to keep it from him, but because the simple act of telling him felt like the crossing of an invisible threshold. "Eleanor," she said at last. "Eleanor," he repeated, as if tasting the sound. "I am Nathaniel." His name fit him in some unspoken way, strong, grounded, with a hint of something untamed. She repeated it silently to herself, committing it to memory. The rain surged briefly against the shutters, and the wind carried the scent of the sea through the cracks in the walls. Nathaniel glanced toward the window, then back at her. "It will not let up soon," he said. "Perhaps that is a kindness. We may speak a while longer without the night calling us elsewhere." The words were simple, but their meaning was not. She met his gaze then, truly met it, and the moment seemed to hold itself still. There was no boldness in the contact, but there was an undeniable understanding, the kind of awareness that needed no declaration, no hurried confession. Outside, the rain whispered against the world, but inside, the silence between them grew warm, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The evening deepened, and the inn's light became a softer, richer gold, as though the fire had grown shy of its own brightness. Eleanor felt the hours slipping by in a way that was both unfamiliar and strangely welcome. She could not remember the last time she had spoken so freely with a stranger, nor the last time a stranger had felt less like one. Nathaniel's voice had a rhythm to it, like waves meeting the shore, sometimes quiet, sometimes rushing forward with a force she could feel. He did not fill the silence needlessly, But when he did speak, his words carried weight. At one point, the conversation drifted to the sea, its tempers, its gifts, its dangers. Nathaniel spoke of it as one might speak of a woman, with respect, with a touch of wariness, and with an intimacy that suggested long acquaintance. "You've sailed?" she asked. "For years," he replied, his eyes momentarily distant, as if seeing a far horizon, long enough to know that the sea keeps its secrets, even from those who think they know her best. The way he said her made Eleanor's breath pause in her throat. She shifted slightly in her chair, trying to disguise the sudden warmth in her chest. Then had grown quieter as the night wore on. The other patrons drifted away one by one, the shuffling of boots and the mutter of goodnights fading into the steady rain outside. Only the innkeeper remained behind the counter, polishing a mug with the deliberate patience of a man who saw everything and spoke of nothing. Nathaniel leaned forward then, resting his forearms on the table, the firelight catching his hair and making it look almost copper at the edges. "Tell me something the world doesn't know about you," he said. The question startled her, not in its boldness, but in the quiet intimacy of it. It felt like a hand reaching gently into the space she kept locked away. She hesitated, her fingers idly circling the rim of her cup. "I keep a journal," she said finally. "I write every day, though no one has ever read a word of it. It's where I put the pieces of myself that don't belong to anyone else." Nathaniel's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something softer. "Then those pages must be a treasure," he said, and his tone made her feel, for just a moment, as though she were the treasure in question. The air between them seemed to tighten, not in discomfort, but in the way a bowstring tightens before it releases. She became aware of small, almost imperceptible things. The faint warmth radiating from him across the table, the sound of his steady breathing, syncing almost unconsciously with her own, the way the flicker of firelight carved subtle hollows in the planes of his face. When they reached the chestnuts again, their hands brushed once more, but this time neither moved away immediately. Her fingertips grazed the back of his hand, and she felt the faint roughness of his skin, as if it had known both rope and salt air. His gaze dropped briefly to where their hands touched, then lifted to meet hers. There was no urgency in his look, but there was an undeniable question in it. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she let her hand linger for a moment longer before withdrawing, her pulse thrumming like the rain against the shutters. A faint smile touched his lips, the kind of smile that wasn't meant for anyone else to see. The fire popped softly, sending a small burst of sparks up the chimney. Nathaniel sat back slightly, though his eyes didn't leave hers. "Some storms," he murmured, "shouldn't be rushed." She wasn't sure if he meant the one outside or the one between them. The rain whispered on, as if it, too, had decided to wait. The hour had grown late enough that the inn's common room felt like a place that existed outside of time. The fire was burning lower now, though collapsing into a deep bed of embers. The innkeeper had finally decided to retire, leaving only a lone lantern swaying gently in the corner, its light painting golden arcs across the wooden beams. Eleanor felt the change in the air when they were truly alone. It was not the absence of others that made it different, but the presence of something else, a quiet awareness that seemed to hum just beneath the sound of the rain. Nathaniel glanced toward the stairs, then back to her. "I think," he said softly, "the night has decided it wants to keep us a while longer." She should have said good night. She should have excused herself, carried her candle upstairs, and closed the door on whatever it was that now thrummed between them. But instead, she found herself nodding, a slow, almost involuntary agreement. They left the common room together, the worn steps of the staircase creaking beneath their weight. Her candle cast long, trembling shadows on the walls, and every few steps she felt him just behind her, close enough that she could sense the warmth of his body, but far enough that the space between them pulsed like a heartbeat. The corridor above was narrow, lined with simple wooden doors. The rain outside was louder here, drumming steadily on the roof overhead. She stopped at her door, turning to face him in the dim light. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world had contracted to the small space between their bodies. She became acutely aware of details she might have missed on another night. The faint sheen of rain still clinging to his coat, the way his eyes seemed darker here in the candlelight, the faint scent of sea salt lingering in the air between them. "You should get some rest," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. She smiled faintly. "And you?" "I'll find sleep eventually," he replied, though his gaze didn't waver. The candle trembled in her hand, the flame bending toward him as though drawn by the same invisible pull she felt. Something passed between them then, unspoken, undeniable. She could have stepped back. She could have turned away. But instead, she stood her ground, feeling the silence wrap around them like the warmest of cloaks. Nathaniel lifted a hand slowly, as though giving her the chance to refuse. When his fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face, she felt the heat of his touch travel all the way down to her spine. Her breath caught, not because it was unexpected, but because it was inevitable. The candle's flame fluttered between them. His hand lingered at her cheek, the calloused edge of his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Words, in this moment, felt like a language too small to hold what was happening. It was the quietest kind of surrender, the kind that begins in the stillness, long before the first kiss. When she finally opened her door, she did so slowly, the movement itself feeling like a question. He stood in the hallway a moment longer, his eyes holding hers, before stepping inside with her. The door closed behind them, and the rain outside became the only witness. The moment the door closed, the world outside ceased to exist. The sound of the rain became a steady, unbroken hymn, as if the sky itself wanted to keep them there, wrapped in this small, warm room, away from the reach of morning. The candle she carried had been set on the table by the bed, its light flickering over the walls in restless shadows. Nathaniel's eyes seemed to follow the movement of the flame, though she knew he was looking at her. For a heartbeat, they both stood still, the kind of stillness that is not absence of movement, but rather the gathering of it. Eleanor could hear her own breathing, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath their boots, the rain slipping down the shutters. When Nathaniel stepped forward, the space between them disappeared with quiet certainty. His coat was still damp from a walk earlier, but his presence radiated warmth that reached her before his hands did. "You should tell me to leave," he murmured, though his tone made it sound like a hope rather than a request. "I could," she replied softly, "but I won't." The candlelight caught the faintest smile on his lips before it was gone. He reached up, brushing his fingers against her cheek again, the same gentle touches in the hallway, but slower now, deliberate. Eleanor felt every inch of the moment, the coarse texture of his coat sleeve near her arm, the faint rhythm of his breath, the way his eyes searched hers as though he were memorizing her face for the rest of his life. When his hand slid to the back of her neck, she leaned into it, not because she had to, but because it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Her eyes fluttered shut at the warmth of his touch, the faint scent of rain and sea filling her lungs. The first kiss was not hurried. It was slow, almost reverent, as though they both understood they were stepping across a threshold that could not be undone. His lips were warm against hers, steady, and when he pulled back, it was only far enough to look at her again. She could have spoken then, but the weight of the moment pressed the words back down. Instead, she traced her fingers along the edge of his jaw, feeling the faint rasp of stubble under her touch. He leaned closer, his forehead brushing hers. "I've been in storms before," he said quietly, "but none like this." The words settled between them, and she understood that he wasn't talking about the rain outside. They moved slowly toward the bed, not as a deliberate choice, but as if drawn there by an unspoken gravity. The old wooden frame creaked faintly when they sat at its edge. The room was dim, the only light the restless flicker of the candle. He removed his coat, draping it over the back of the chair, and the motion gave her a moment to simply look at him. The strong lines of his shoulders, the way his hair, still damp, clung to his temples. When he turned back to her, something shifted. The tension between them was no longer just an invisible thread, but a living thing, breathing in time with them both. They talked then, but quietly, their voices low as if afraid the night might overhear and end too soon. She told him small pieces of herself, memories she rarely shared, thoughts she had never said aloud. He listened with the kind of attention that made her feel as though she were the only person left in the world. At some point, his hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. He traced slow circles against her skin with his thumb, each one sending a small shiver through her. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady drumbeat that filled the silence between their words. Time seemed to bend, stretching and folding until she no longer knew how long they'd been sitting there, close enough for her knee to brush his with every small shift. When the candle burned low, Nathaniel leaned in again, his lips brushing hers, still unhurried, but deeper now, lingering. Her hands moved of their own accord, resting against his chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The kiss deepened, and with it, the sense that they were no longer simply talking or touching, but learning each other, each movement a question and an answer at the same time. Outside, the night went on. The rain did not stop. The wind did not falter, and the world beyond that small room remained distant, irrelevant. For the rest of their lives, they would remember that night, not for what they said, nor for the storm that had driven them indoors, but for the way the world itself seemed to hold its breath for them, as if aware that something rare and unrepeatable was unfolding in its care. And when at last the candle gave its final flicker, and the room fell into darkness, they did not move apart. The rain whispered against the shutters, speaking in a language they could not understand, but they knew, somehow, it was speaking their names.